I guess it's okay for me to start. First and foremost, I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your evening. I know you could be doing different things, so I sincerely appreciate it. So I want to welcome you to my dissertation presentation titled The Lived Experiences from the Perspective of Former Junior Enlisted Marines, a Qualitative Narrative Inquiry. Now, the overview is going to provide a general summary of the content that's in my dissertation and the content that's in my presentation. And that's going to include the statement of the problem, the purpose statement, the research question, conceptual framework, relevant literature, some uncommon terms, methodology, the results and conclusions, implications, significance of the study, recommendations for future research, limitations, and lastly, we'll end with the opportunity for questions. Now, the problem statement. The Marine Corps relies heavily upon its leadership to train, mentor, and develop subordinates. However, there's been research studies that's shown that destructive leadership is on the rise. And with that being said, the senior leader's ability to lead has been put into question. Now, the specific problem is the Marine Corps does not have any formal leadership development schools for senior leaders to improve their leadership skills and make them a more well-rounded Marine. It is the notion that by the time that enlisted Marine reaches this senior leadership status, he or she already possesses the necessary knowledge and skills to effectively lead. And the purpose statement, the purpose of this qualitative narrative inquiry was to explore former junior enlisted Marines' lived involvements with senior leaders to understand their experiences and if they played a role in their decision to conclude their military service. Now, this study will reveal if the participants have experienced destructive leadership behavior by senior leaders. In addition, it will also reveal if it played a role in them to conclude their military service. And lastly, it may inform that the Marine Corps and maybe other branches of service, there's a possibility of toxicity in its ranks. Now, Mustak noted when constructing a research question, it must be clear and concise so the purpose and intent are apparent. So the research question that I came up with is how do former junior enlisted Marines perceive destructive leadership behavior by senior leaders and the role that it has on retention? Now, the conceptual framework, now that helped assessing the goals of my study, in addition to constructing my research question and to determine the methodology. Now, one way I did that was helping me identify gaps in present research and to include possibilities of my own. Now, how I did that was, so for example, my initial intent was to study all the positive aspects of leadership and how people are developing, how they grow. But I realized when I saw that when I went into it with that mindset, I saw a lot of studies that covered that content, not necessarily military specific, but just in general. And I noticed there was very limited study on toxic leadership behavior and the ramifications it have on subordinates. So that caused me to change my study. I also help with biases because every research possibly it has noted that they go into a certain project with their own biases. So the conceptual framework helped me identify maybe some of the potential biases that were in some of the current literature and also some of the biases that I may have went into this study with. And there was an article written in an international journal where the author stated that the conceptual framework is not necessarily determine a hardcore fact, but is understand the soft intentions of interpretation, which I thought was very interesting. Now, this is some of the most relevant literature that I used during my research. Now, this literature you see here by these individuals pretty much focus on bad leaders, and it talks about, some of it talks about toxic leadership. But none of it really addressed this junior-senior relationship and some of the ramifications that it can have on an individual. So this was part of my guiding force, and it helped guide me to where I wound up at the end of my study. Some uncommon terms throughout. It's a military study, so some of the terms are just military specific. So starting with command. A command is a series of units that's led by one individual, and the personnel can extend well into the thousands. On destructive leadership, the term per se is not necessarily uncommon, but when I would have discussions with people about my study, their question to me was, well, what do you mean by destructive leadership? While destructive leadership is an action used to gain a desired results with negative implications. And in turn, it can have a devastating effect on personnel and the organization over the long term. Then I got the same response when it came to destructive leadership behavior. But they were like, well, what do you mean by destructive leadership behavior? Well, it's a systematic approach to leadership that's used by destructive leaders to disrupt an organization operations. They undermine the leaders within the organization and also affect the well-being of subordinates. Operational tempo. Operational tempo is just the business of a unit. The higher the operational tempo is, the busier the unit is. And lastly, unit is just a company size element that consists of anywhere from 125 to 290 personnel. Now, the research methodology. Now, I chose for this a qualitative approach because it emphasizes the socially constructed nature of reality. It's about recording and analyzing and attempting to uncover a deeper meaning and significance of human behavior and experience. Now, I didn't choose quantitative because it involves collecting data and convert it into numerical form so that statistical calculations can be made and conclusions drawn. And I went with a narrative approach because a narrative approach captures the understanding of the lived experience through story, in this case, 15 former junior enlisted Marines, about a specific event. Now, Clannon and Connolly noted the best way to study experience is through a narrative inquiry. Now, the data collected, it consisted of a 9-question instrument. In addition to the 9-question instrument, it was one-on-one interviews. They were done over the phone, recorded with 2 devices. In addition to the recording, notes were taken in at the same time as I was recording the interviews. And in Vivo software was used to analyze the data. Of course, it's a coding software that involves a 7-step process. The first thing I did was I imported the data. I developed the themes from the data. I reviewed the data, checked the text queries, coded for analysis, analyzed the data, then I went on ahead and wrote the results. And it allowed me to perform a systematic review, which in the process, 6 core themes emerged. Now, answering the question, based off of the responses from the participants, the 15 participants, the question was answered within the guidelines of the 6 core themes that emerged from their responses. The 6 core themes are leadership traits and characteristics, which identified the leadership traits and characteristics that the participants prefer in a leader. Effective retention, it revealed what made the participants leave the military, and in turn, what would have made them stay. Well-being, focused on the participants' well-being. Learning from destructive leaders revealed that living in a toxic environment, what was their takeaway from their experiences? Regrets focus on any regrets they have about leaving active duty service. And devotedness was a time of reflection. It revealed their true feelings about the Marine Corps. Theme 1, leadership traits and characteristics. The data revealed that 100% of participants wanted a good leader who would set the example and show them the way so they can be successful. They wanted a leader who was an ideal role model and would lead in a professional manner that he or she would conduct himself in the same manner when no one was around to observe. Now, what they also want, in addition to a good leader to set an example, was a leader who had effective leadership skills. 88% of the participants mentioned having a good leader with listening skills because they wanted to know that when they were addressing the leader with some concerns, he or she was actively listening and would take us, were receptive to what they was trying to convey. In addition, they wanted to know that anytime they had an opinion about something to share their views, they wanted to know that the leader would actually consider their opinion instead of looking at their rank and say, basically having a notion that they were not worthy. Now, along with good listening skills, 82% of the leaders mentioned they wanted someone with good knowledge, someone who could train and develop them to both personally and professionally. And that was one of the things that, again, 82% expressed that was important to them. But what was more important, and the same thing with having somebody that set a good example was having a leader who was trustworthy. 100% of participants wanted a leader who was trustworthy. They felt that having a leader who was trustworthy provided them with a sense of security, and they didn't have nothing to worry about. In addition, they knew that if they had a leader who was trustworthy, they could go with them with personal and sensitive information without confidentiality being broken. Second thing, effective retention. All the participants wanted good leaders. However, only 94% of the participants experienced having a relationship with good leaders. They wanted leaders to lead, show them how to lead, train, mentor, and develop them. They felt that the leaders that they had were selfish, inconsiderate, and had no care about well-being. But 94% of the participants stated that they felt the reason why because they were immature. And the other 88% noted that they felt that the leaders were, trying to think of the term, they felt that they were self-centered. They had a need to have that power. So in their minds, it affected their ability to lead. Now, with all the toxicity they were facing, they felt that if they had a new job assignment, it would have been a relief for the toxicity. So since having a new job assignment required them to go into a different duty station, they looked at it as, well, if I go to a new duty station, it's a possibility that I won't experience toxic leadership behavior. And it's like getting a fresh new start. 82% of the participants experience a high operational tempo. Their schedule was so busy that they did not get enough time to mentally and physically recuperate. From the time they started training, they were deployed. And before they could mentally and physically recover, it was the time to deploy again. So slower operational tempo kind of go hand in hand with family welfare, because the busyness also affected the family. It bleeded over to the family. And there's been studies that show that not only does a high operational tempo affect the family, but so does structured leadership behavior that participants experience at work. There was a study conducted by Black in 2015, and her participants, once they found out what their significant other was experiencing at work, they felt helpless. They felt that it was nothing they can do. And then there was an article written by a young lady named Miss Ricketts. She wrote it in 2014. She had mentioned when her husband deployed to Somalia, it had a devastating effect on her, and she's experienced stress like she never experienced before. And this kind of coincides with what one of my participants mentioned to me, and he mentioned that all the stress that he had at work dealing with destructive leaders, he would go home and it ultimately affected his family and his relationship. In addition, it almost jeopardized their marriage. But this kind of behavior and the high op tempo doesn't necessarily stop with just significant others. It also affects children. There was a study conducted by the Military Family Association in 2011, and it concluded that kids of service members experience more mental behavior problems than non-military children due to a constant separation and internal stress. Theme 3, well-being. All the participants wanted, all 100% wanted to be fairly treated. They felt that if they were fairly treated, they would have had a more respect for their leader. There was one particular participant mentioned she was in a predominantly all-male unit. So she was spirit harassment, sexism, sexual harassment. She was ostracized. So she did not receive the fair treatment that she wanted. And 88% of participants experienced some sort of not being fairly treated. And self-centered. All the participants, I think another 94% of the same participants felt that their leaders were self-centered and only cared about themselves. They looked at them and considered them a narcissistic leader where nothing mattered but them. And one participant expressed that her senior leader was self-centered. He only cared about himself. He did not have compassion, which ultimately affected her well-being. One of the most memorable and influential experiences that a person can possibly have is experience with destructive leaders. Scholars have noted that destructive leaders does have a strong influence on subordinates, but the fear is that their influence is so strong that subordinates tend to adopt that same behavior and become destructors themselves. But there was a study that showed one particular study The researchers concluded from her participants that yes, destructive leadership is very influential. However, her participants were motivated enough to lead opposite how they were led. To coincide with the participants in my study, they did not want to lead how they were led. So they took all that negative energy and turned it into a positive because they did not want their Marines to suffer the same way they did. So they chose also to lead opposite of the example that was presented to them. Theme 5, regrets. When participants was asked about leaving the military, two themes emerged. They gave up too soon and the existence of good leaders. 94% of the participants felt they gave up on the Marine Corps too soon. They felt they were at a time and place in their career that they were tired of the toxic leadership behavior, that it was time to move on to the military. But looking back, they realized they should have probably stayed in the Marine Corps, and they made note that eventually they would have been senior leaders, and they would have been able to make the positive influence that they wanted to make on individuals that their leaders didn't make on them. But in the process, all the participants agreed that good leaders do exist. 88% of participants actually work for good leaders, and they set a good example for them. However, just the last senior leaders they had prior to them ending their military service were destructive. So it left a bad taste in their mouth. And one participant expressed that after his bad experience, his main regret was not giving another leader the chance and opportunity to lead, train, and develop him. Devotedness. The finding from this study also revealed how participants truly felt about the Marine Corps. They were allowed to reflect and add any additional information, about their life and experience on the Marine Corps. And 14 of the 15 participants expressed a deep-rooted love and compassion for the Marine Corps. Of those 14, 13 would have been willing and would go back on active duty if they were allowed the opportunity. They also concluded that they're a lot older and a lot wiser, and knowing what they know now, they would have handled dealing with destructive leadership differently. And even after being out of the military, they still find themselves advocating for the Marine Corps. And the answer to that answers the question of a narrative study. How did participants make sense of their experiences? Well, it's simple. After spending time on active duty and reflecting on their career, and in addition, going back to the civilian life and reflecting on that life, they realized the Marine Corps is a great organization. Their problems did not lie with the Marine Corps. They all concluded that the Marine Corps is not the problem. Leaders who displayed destructive leadership were. Now, with the help of 15 participants, this study explored the lived experiences and perceptions of 15 former junior enlisted Marines to gain an understanding as their experiences, their chain of experiences would weave into a narrative. Now, the problem statement identified the lack of research to cover the gap because there's not much on toxic leadership or destructive leadership. I mean, there is some, but it's very limited. The research question were answered in full text. The conceptual framework assisted with the goals of the study. And the themes were reflected of participants' lived experiences dealing with senior leaders who display destructive leadership behavior, which in turn will add to the body of knowledge and add new knowledge to the existing literature. Now, the implications. The research question for this study was supported by the emerging themes that expanded the literature into the conceptual framework, that enabled the participants to think reflectively about their experience with their senior leaders. And participants gave descriptions of their personal experiences from their senior leaders who displayed destructive leadership behaviors towards them. Now, the data collection and interpretation were significant in understanding those lived experiences. And in the process, new data emerged into 6 core themes, which created an understanding and comparing and contrasting with the existing literature. Significance, there's limited research. As I mentioned earlier in the study or in my brief, there's a lot of positive leadership, or anytime I pick up a book, or most of the books I have, when I went to look them online or whatever the case, most of them were about positive leadership. There are very little that covered destructive, and even littler that covered destructive leadership behavior and the impact and ramifications it can have on subordinates. So it's unique from different studies. Related to the Marine Corps, I came probably across one additional leadership study. However, that study only focused on the positive aspects and some of the traits and principles that were effective in helping the organization succeed. Educating the current and future military leaders and non-military organizations, it will give them new knowledge of the possible toxicity that can go on within their organization or within their ranks, to let them know that, it may cause them to look at how they develop leaders in their organization. So again, it provides new knowledge to the field of leadership, and it will give them a new discussion on topics. Now, some of the things I recommend for future studies. This study is about former junior enlisted Marines, but I suggest that active duty Marines, junior enlisted Marines, talking to 3 participants mentioned that if they were on active duty, it's a good chance, they couldn't be certain, but it's a good chance their responses might have been slightly different or more vague because fear of reprisal. Fear of reprisal. Active duty junior officers, because based off of their commission status, they automatically, once they enter the Marine Corps, come in a leadership position, regardless, even in a position higher than those of senior enlisted leaders who could have well over 20 years of armed services. So it'd be good to get just perspectives of destructive leadership experiences from their perspective. Active duty junior females. In 2017, nearly half of the commanders who were relieved because of destructive leadership behavior towards female Marines. The 3 participants that I had were female, and they experienced things that the male didn't experience. So to capture that essence would be, capture their experiences would add more value and more knowledge and address destructive leadership from their standpoint. Active duty junior female Marines who were assigned to combat units. There were 2 studies that I came across, one conducted by the Army, one conducted by the Marine Corps. The Army did theirs in 2015, the Marine Corps did theirs in 2014. So the Army assessed, because when you're in the all-male environment, there's no females. There's no female leaders. Your interaction with females are almost non-existent. So they had a problem with, as they say, female leadership. They use the word as feminist style leadership was the verbiage that was used in the study. And a lot of them had a problem with having a female supervisor. In addition to that, going to combat, they felt their masculinity would have taken over if the female was in trouble. They may have just totally disregarded the mission and went to save her, which would have compromised the mission. And the Marine Corps took a sample of males and females. They created an integrated company. So they broke it down into 2 groups, one of all males, one of female and males, and they ran them through a series of combat scenarios. And of course, the males outperformed the females in all scenarios. And so at the end of the study, both concluded that they opposed the integration. However, they were overridden by the Defense Secretary. The limitations were using Marine veterans 35 and under. That kind of focused on the era of Afghanistan and Iraq. If I would have changed it to, let's say, a much older age, to the Vietnam era, the results could have been completely different. The study does not focus on women specifically. As I had mentioned previously, the 3 of my participants experienced things that men did not experience. The study does not focus on leaders' perspective of subordinates. It only focused on destructive leadership behaviors experienced by junior enlisted Marines or former junior enlisted Marines. But there are dysfunctional and disruptive subordinates. So it doesn't capture how the senior leader handles that or how he or she adjusts to dealing with their disruptive subordinates. And it's junior Marine specific. Does not capture the essence of the Army, Navy, Air Force, or even Coast Guard. It doesn't cover the broad perspective. The results may vary. It may yield different results. So these are the references that I used during this presentation. I sincerely appreciate your time, more than you know. Any questions?
Thank you, Darnell.
My pleasure.
And now we can open up the floor for questions. Dr. Chambers, looks like you're next on the list. Would you like to start?
Sure. Darnell, thank you. That was clear, clearly presented,
Thank you.
and appreciate the details that you added. A few questions. Can
Sure.
you share why this study is important to you professionally? Not professionally, but personally?
Personally, and it's funny because it kind of coincides with what the subordinate stated, that 14 of the 15 still have a deep-rooted love for the Marine Corps. I spent 27 years on active duty, and of that, I spent probably almost 10 years as a senior enlisted leader. So I've always had a leadership style that was more servant. And so I was sensitive to the needs of the Marine Corps. And even now, I want the Marine Corps to be successful. So it was deep rooted in me to do whatever I can, even after I left the military, to give some sort of input that would make the organization take it throughout the 21st century, well after I'm completely gone. So that's why it was important to me, because I still have that deep rooted passion and love that the participants talked about. And I totally understand it.
Okay, thanks. Next question. Regarding the conceptual framework of your study, for example, locus of control. How did that theory? How is that theory applicable to your study?
Well, I did some research and I noticed that a lot of leaders just getting information. A lot of commanders had a desire to have the locus of control. They wanted to control everything. So to me, it more so fell under, I don't want to call it micromanaging, but it's to the need to have control. And what I learned in the process of those who are like that, it does affect the organization negatively, and it can have long-term ramifications. So looking at it from a destructive leadership standpoint, that kind of behavior can have a long-term ramifications also. So that's where I came over locus of control doing a conceptual framework, because it ties in the study of the sense of, in a sense, it could be dysfunction. Did not categorize that, but it was the underlining verbiage that kind of led toward a dysfunctional way, which kind of related to my study.
Thank you. Next question. We all know that qualitative results are limited. Tell us whether or not your qualitative results can be generalized to all former Marines or not.
Well, to generalize to all former Marines, that I cannot say, because I only use a sample of 15. I mean, it could be what I noticed. I spent time on the East Coast and the West Coast. And everyone I know that spent time as a Marine always said that they're different. They train differently. Like it's a whole nother organization. Yes, it's still a Marine Corps, but I don't know if it's the environment. I think a study should be done on it. My focus is on the East Coast participants who are stationed in the southeastern part. Those who spent time or spent their whole career on the West Coast, they may have a different stamp. They may have a different viewpoint. So it does not apply specifically former Marine Corps wide to former Marines. Just I can narrow it down to those participants. So I can't speak generally because that would be an unfair assessment.
Very good. And my last question is, as a novice researcher, how would you describe your reflections as a researcher while conducting this study?
That's a good question. So it's funny you would ask that question because it coincides with my last slide. Research is what I'm doing when I don't know exactly what I'm doing. So it's one of them things that it was an eye opener for me. Trying to grasp the whole research, the whole process. I would say this, at this point where I'm at now, I want to do it again. But if you would have asked me that maybe a year or two ago, I would have said, no, I am not doing this again. But I like the end state because you get to add to knowledge. And the more I do that, the more experienced I'll become, because I do want to write journals and articles and things. So I do want to increase the gap or help decrease the gap in literature. So, yeah, just trying to get a good understanding of it has been a experience that I will never, ever forget.
Okay, thank you. I'm done.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Darnell,
Yes, ma'am.
to piggyback on that last question, what do you see your study contributing to the literature? What are the implications of your results that you feel would make a contribution to the literature? And how does it contribute to that covering the gap in the literature, your results?
Well, the results in the literature, like I said, some of the literature that I came across, it just discussed toxic leadership, and this is what it is. None of it discussed. So what it will add is some of the ramifications or the effects that it can have on individuals. In addition to the literature that I came across, none of them gave solutions. They always talked about the problem. So what I put in my research was possible solutions, things that can help bridge the gap in X, Y, and Z. Now, it's not necessarily, it may not be just restricted to my study, but in my field of leadership, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but all the research I came across, I have not come across one to say, okay, these are corrective measures of how to fix, how to solve X, Y, and Z, or these are some possible solutions that organizations can take. So it adds to the body of literature that way. It increased the body of ours. It is toxicity, and there are destructive leadership behaviors. It would open the question of, okay, well, if there are destructive leaders, how do we solve the problem? Or what is the root of the problem? So it would spark more, hopefully, studies, if not conducted by myself, more research from individuals to even close the gap even more.
Okay. Leadership is a field with tons and tons of research, years and years. There's volumes and volumes that have been published in the field of leadership. It may not be specifically to the Marines. It may be in many other areas, fields, companies, industries. I mean, there's tons of research on leadership in many aspects of many different aspects of leadership. So why the Marines? Why is it different? Why is it important to study the Marines in this case?
Well, in this case, why I was studying, why it was important to me, because, the Marine Corps pretty much helped guide me, not necessarily to the point where I am today. So it's embedded in me to the point that I have that passion. As I mentioned earlier, I have that passion. So I want the organization to be successful. So even when I was on active duty, I would do whatever I can to make it successful. And seeing that I'm no longer on active duty, I still want to contribute. I still want to find a way to improve the organization overall. Like I said, the Marine Corps studies that I came across, no one wants to highlight the bad part of it. No one wants to highlight some of the dysfunction. Trying to get approvals were a heartache, because I remember a particular commander was like, "Nah, I can't have you interviewing my Marines." Why not? If there was nothing to hide, what's the problem? So he had a problem with that, because my initial intent was to do active duty, but it required more red tape. I mean, so I just want the Marine Corps to understand that it does exist. It's no secret, but I want you to fix it. Here are ways to help improve it. I want to make it aware. I want to bring it to the forefront so people know, like, you know what? I hope some people would say, you know what, this is a problem. We do need to develop this. We do need to create this so to improve our organization. Again, it's not just specific to the Marine Corps because it can cover all branches of service and non-military organizations as well.
Okay. Then knowing this, if you had the chance to do your study again, did you see any advantages or disadvantages to doing a quantitative study instead of qualitative study? What would you gain from doing quantitative research on this topic?
Quantitative? I just want to make sure.
Yes.
Well, again, if I did a quantitative study, it would just give me statistical facts, and depending on my questions, that it depends on the questions. I know a little bit about quantitative, but I'm not very diverse in it, so I can't give you a valid answer in that aspect. But I know it deals with statistical information. Now, I could come up with, if I wanted to gain statistical data regarding, let's say, how many people, if I was looking for numbers, I could do surveys and I could send it out throughout the Marine Corps wide because the sample base is a lot larger. So I may get a more accurate, and maybe I don't even want to use the word accurate, a different assessment based off of the volume size of the sample frame per se. But I can't say if I would get better information if I did a quantitative.
Right, not better, but what type of information?
Well, if I were to do a quantitative, I guess I would explore the aspects of, you know what? Honestly, I never really thought about that. I've never really thought about if I did a quantitative, what would I try to learn?
Okay, and
so I really can't say what I would try to learn.
Okay, that's your answer. That's your answer. But because you plan to continue researching in this field, consider the possibilities of what else could you contribute to because that is the point, right? To present and to contribute to the literature. So would changing the methodology provide you other ways of covering that gap in the literature that you found? Just an idea for future research then.
No, and I sincerely appreciate it.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for your answers.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm back, Darnell.
Okay, so, I'm here.
I'm hearing a little echo when I talk. Is it sounding okay?
On my end, it sounds fine. I don't hear nothing on my end.
All right, that's
No
great.
echo.
So all right, terrific. So just a logistical question, first of all. When you created the transcripts from the interviews, how did you do that? Did you create them yourself? Did you send them out to external service? How did that happen?
Actually, when I created the when I transcribed it, I actually did it myself. I sit here and listen to the recording, and it was a lot of work. And I don't type that fast. I type okay. I just don't type that fast. So I spent, once I got past QRF, I was on a mission. And I'm like, you know what? I want to get this done as quickly as possible. Yeah. You know, plus I know I'm coming up on 8 years next year. And I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to start. I did look at transcription services, but I'm like, you know what? I'll do it myself. And that's what I did. I sat there and got on the computer and I typed them all up in a Word doc. And that's how I transcribed all my data.
Good. Did you follow up with the participants with your notes to see if they agreed with what you wrote?
I did. What I did was, once I transcribed all the data, I sent them an email transcript to see if it coincided, to make sure that I didn't misinterpret nothing that was stated. And then I got a response from all of them, and so I had no problems there.
Good. So they all agreed with your transcription
Yes.
then.
Yes, sir.
Good. How did you find in Vivo to work with? Was it, you like it, user-friendly, productive?
Not really. It wasn't. It was confusing, and I've watched the tutorials on it, and I try to gain an understanding. But I think what was beneficial for me that I noticed that it had an auto coding and query-based features that I use that made it simpler for me. So once I uploaded all the data, I used that because it was suitable for all my transcriptions. It had all the same questions were asked to all the participants. So that made it easy. If I didn't do that, I'm not really sure, but it was confusing, and I had to call some people that I knew who've done it just to get some better insight to help me understand. And I can't say if I fully understand it now, but like I said, that auto feature was very beneficial for me.
Yeah. Next time you do it, it'll be better. Question about toxicity. So, and you may have mentioned this, it wasn't a question that you asked, but could you surmise how prevalent is toxicity among leaders? Is it common? I mean, we could all look in our past and find leaders that we felt were toxic, but would that be the majority, predominant, or how would you see that?
Well, by the participants, it was common.
Really?
That was, yeah, and I was surprised, but I was very taken. You know, I would think, okay, it'll be an even balance. But listening to the participants express themselves and tell their story, I was shocked. That was probably a big surprise for me because I did not expect the results that I got. I'm thinking, okay, well, you know, I know there are a lot of good leaders out there. I know quite a few of them. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, okay, so let me explore and see what I can find. And based off, I mean, I've had some, they started off with good leaders, then somewhere along the line, halfway through their career, they came across a series of bad leaders. And I know participants, they had good leaders all the way through. So they had no issues. But the other 13, I mean, it was a lot worse than I thought. So the toxicity spread it. I'm not really sure what happened. But yeah, it was more common than not, which was a surprise for me.
So do you think that people who had poor leaders were drawn to your study because they wanted to tell their story? Do you think it might have been skewed for people who had negative experiences?
Oh, no. The only reason why I would say that is because I think most of them were just willing to participate. Like I said, I had two that had not even experienced instructor leadership. They made the point that all the leaders were helpful. You know, they basically took care of them their whole career. And they went from different, not just the same unit they started with, but they went to other units and they experienced the same thing. So they praised their leaders. They had nothing bad to say. And I was happy about that. So I wouldn't say it's skewed based off of that. And then some, like I said, mentioned that, I started off great. My career was great. I had great leaders. And then this happened. You know, so.
Okay. So given that, how do you account for the lack of information regarding toxic leadership in the Marines?
Well, I account for as far as what I mentioned is about doing additional studies that should be researched. Because one thing I mentioned about females, they experience things differently. And based off of two studies that one conducted by the Marine Corps, one conducted by the Army about integration, it was the perception that males would have a problem with it. So, of course, the Defense Secretary said, no, it's going to happen. So I am really curious to know the end state of that. You know, I'm curious. So I think additional studies and some of my recommended choices would be beneficial to the overall experience of destructive leadership behavior.
Okay. Well, I think it's a rich topic. I think you've got a lot of opportunity ahead for this. Okay, I don't have any other questions.
I have a couple of comments real quick before you go.
Sure.
Darnell?
Yes, ma'am.
I've seen the title of your paper different in different places, so you just want to make sure you're using the right one at all times.
Yes, I will go back and verify, check that. I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome. And second is you do need to double check very carefully your list of references because not all of them are in APA format.
Okay, I'll make a note of that right now.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Darnell,
All right, are we ready?
just
Go
one
ahead.
question. Just, well, not really a question, but a comment. Well, yes, a question. Darnell, are you planning on using an APA editor to finalize your manuscript for publication?
Yes, ma'am.
That would take a load off of you, and publication requires precise APA Phoenix format.
Yeah.
Okay. And I made a note of that too. Thank you, Kat. Thank you for that valuable information.
You're welcome.
All right, are we ready for Darnell to sign off?
Yes, he'll need
Yes.
to stop the recording before he signs off.
Recording.